August 1943, Camp White, Oregon. 500 Japanese prisoners of war stood in formation under the towering ponderosa pines, their uniforms still bearing the stains of tropical combat from distant Pacific islands. They had been told by American officers that tomorrow they would witness something impossible, something their commanders back home had assured them did not exist in nature. The prisoners exchanged skeptical glances, certain this was another psychological tactic in a war already lost. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men were about to experience would shatter not just their understanding of American geography, but their entire conception of the nation they had been taught to view as spiritually and culturally inferior. The journey to Crater Lake would become one of the most unusual episodes of the Pacific War, a moment when natural wonder accomplished what no amount of propaganda ever could. Lieutenant Sergeant Yoshio Yamada pressed his face against the window of the Army transport truck as it climbed through the Cascade Range. At 32 years old, he had served in the Imperial Japanese Army for nearly a decade, fighting across China and later in the Solomon Islands before his capture at Guadalcanal. The landscape rolling past contradicted everything he had been told during his military training. His instructors had described America as a nation of concrete cities and barren plains, a country that had exhausted its natural resources through greed and waste. Yet here were forests that seemed to stretch forever, trees so massive they dwarfed anything he had seen in Japan. The road carved through volcanic rock formations, past waterfalls that thundered down cliffs hundreds of feet high. Yamada pulled out a small notebook he had been permitted to keep and began sketching what he saw, though he doubted anyone back home would believe his drawings. Beside him sat Corporal Takeshi Nakamura, a 24-year-old farm boy from Hokkaido who had been conscripted 3 years earlier. Nakamura had spent his childhood helping his father tend rice paddies in the shadow of Mount Yotei. He considered himself knowledgeable about natural beauty, but this American wilderness unsettled him with its sheer scale and wildness. The forests at home were carefully managed, every tree serving a purpose. These woods seemed chaotic, untamed, abundant beyond reason. The convoy of 6 trucks carried prisoners selected for good behavior from Camp White, a facility that housed over 7,000 Japanese captives. Major Robert Harrison of the Army Corps had proposed this unusual excursion. A former geology professor from the University of Oregon, Harrison believed that showing prisoners the natural wealth of America might prove more effective than any interrogation technique or propaganda film. His superiors were skeptical but approved the experiment as part of a broader psychological operations program. Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female officers involved in POW camp administration, sat in the lead vehicle. At 29, she had studied psychology at Columbia University before the conflict began. She had volunteered for this assignment specifically because she wanted to understand how education and experience could overcome ideological indoctrination. She had spent months interviewing prisoners, learning about their backgrounds, their families, their beliefs. What she discovered was that most had no particular hatred for Americans. They simply believed what their government had told them, that the United States was a declining power, spiritually weak, incapable of sustaining a long conflict. Mitchell had convinced Harrison that this trip could serve as a test case. If they could change the perceptions of these 500 men, those men might influence others when they eventually returned home. She knew that some officers viewed this as naive, but she had seen enough of this conflict to know that military victory alone would not guarantee lasting peace. Hearts and minds, she had written in one report, are won through demonstration, not declaration. The trucks climbed higher into the mountains. The prisoners fell silent as the landscape transformed. They passed through areas where volcanic activity had left bizarre rock formations, twisted columns of stone that looked like frozen waterfalls. Some of the younger prisoners pointed and whispered among themselves. Guards who spoke Japanese reported that many thought they were being taken to some kind of work camp in these mountains, perhaps to dig tunnels or mine ore. None suspected the true destination. Private First Class Kenji Sato, barely 20 years old, felt his heart race as the elevation increased. He had lied about his age to enlist, joining at 17, with dreams of glory. The reality of combat in the Pacific had stripped away those illusions within weeks. He had seen friends die from disease, starvation, and bombardment before he was finally captured, half-starved and delirious, during a failed retreat through the jungle. The Americans had fed him, treated his wounds, and housed him in conditions far better than what he had endured under his own officers. This confused Sato more than anything else. He had been taught that Americans were cruel, that they tortured prisoners and showed no mercy. Yet in 6 months of captivity, he had received medical care, adequate food, even access to books and writing materials. Some guards were harsh, certainly, but no more so than his own sergeants had been. He was beginning to suspect that much of what he had been told was false. This trip, whatever its purpose, might provide more answers. The convoy reached the rim of Crater Lake just after noon. Major Harrison had timed the arrival carefully, ensuring the summer sun would be at the perfect angle to illuminate the water. He ordered the trucks to stop at a viewpoint where the entire caldera would be visible at once. The guards opened the truck beds and instructed the prisoners to form up in orderly lines, then led them to the edge. What happened next, according to multiple written accounts from both prisoners and guards, was complete silence for nearly 30 seconds. 500 men simply stood and stared, unable to process what they were seeing. Then someone began to laugh, a sound that was equal parts wonder and disbelief. Others joined in, not mockingly, but in the way people laugh when confronted with something so unexpected that their minds cannot immediately categorize it. The lake stretched before them, nearly 6 miles across, cradled in the collapsed remains of an ancient volcano. But it was the color that stopped every man in his tracks. The water was not merely blue. It was a shade of blue so deep, so pure, so impossibly vivid that it seemed artificial, as if someone had filled a massive crater with dye or painted the surface with pigment. The clarity was such that they could see details on the lake floor far below, and the water seemed to glow with an inner light. Sergeant Yamada stood frozen, his notebook forgotten in his hand. He had sailed across much of the Pacific Ocean. He had seen the waters off Okinawa, the seas around Taiwan, the coastal areas of China. He considered himself familiar with every variation of blue that water could achieve. This was beyond his experience, beyond his vocabulary. The Japanese language had specific terms for different shades of blue, but none of them seemed adequate for what lay before him. Beside him, Corporal Nakamura shook his head slowly, a gesture captured in photographs taken that day by Army Signal Corps photographers. Later, when interviewed, Nakamura would say he thought initially that the Americans had somehow created an elaborate illusion, perhaps a painted backdrop or a trick of light and mirrors. Only when a guard led a group down a trail closer to the shore, close enough to touch the water, did he accept that this was real. Captain Mitchell watched the prisoners' reactions carefully, making mental notes for her report. She saw grown men weeping openly, something that would have been unthinkable in the rigid military culture from which they came. Others sat down heavily, as if their legs could no longer support them. A few appeared angry, though whether at being deceived by their own government or at having their worldview shattered, she could not tell. Major Harrison had prepared a brief presentation. Through interpreters, he explained the lake's formation. Nearly 8,000 years ago, Mount Mazama had erupted with a force that would have dwarfed anything in recorded history. The mountain had collapsed into itself, creating a caldera nearly 2,000 feet deep. Over millennia, rain and snowmelt had filled this bowl, creating a body of water with no inlet or outlet streams. The extraordinary purity of the water, fed only by precipitation, combined with its great depth, produced the remarkable color. The numbers themselves were staggering. The lake held approximately 18 trillion gallons of water. Its maximum depth reached 1,943 feet, making it the deepest lake in the United States and the 9th deepest in the world. The water was so clear that visibility extended to depths of over 100 feet. Harrison watched as the interpreters conveyed these figures, saw the prisoners struggling to comprehend the scale. But it was more than just the physical statistics that affected the prisoners. One man, a former schoolteacher named Hiroshi Tanaka, later wrote in his diary that the lake represented a fundamental challenge to everything he had been taught about America. His military instructors had claimed that the United States was a young nation without history, without the deep connection to land and nature that defined Japanese civilization. Yet here was a natural wonder that had existed for 8,000 years, long before either nation had formed. Tanaka wrote that he realized in that moment how thoroughly he had been lied to. If his commanders had been wrong about something this basic, this factual, what else had they misrepresented? The depth of the deception made him feel not just foolish, but betrayed. He had risked his life, had seen friends die, for leaders who had fed him nothing but falsehoods. The prisoners were given 2 hours at the lake. They were allowed to walk along designated paths, always under guard but with surprising freedom. Some sat and sketched. Others wrote letters that they knew would never be sent, but needed to compose anyway. Many simply stared at the water, trying to memorize every detail to carry back with them. Private Sato found himself standing next to one of the American guards, a corporal from Montana named James Wheeler. Wheeler spoke a bit of Japanese learned from a college roommate before the conflict. The two young men stood in awkward silence for a moment before Sato found the courage to speak. He asked if Wheeler had seen the lake before. The corporal nodded and explained that he had visited as a child on a family trip. His father had been a park ranger. He described fishing in mountain streams, camping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, watching bears catch salmon in rivers. Sato listened, realizing that this American soldier had grown up with a freedom to explore nature that he, as the son of a shopkeeper in crowded Tokyo, had never known. Wheeler asked Sato about Japan, about what it was like there. Sato described his neighborhood, the small shrine near his house, the festival days when everyone wore traditional clothing. He talked about his mother's cooking, about his younger sister who wanted to become a teacher. Wheeler listened and said it sounded nice, that he hoped Sato would get to go home someday. This simple exchange, witnessed by Captain Mitchell and recorded in her notes, represented exactly what she had hoped this trip might accomplish. Two young men who had been trained to view each other as inhuman enemies, talking about family and home, and the simple experiences that connect all people. It was a small moment, easily overlooked, but Mitchell believed that thousands of such small moments might eventually add up to something larger. As the afternoon wore on, Major Harrison gathered the prisoners for one final presentation. He had brought a selection of photographs showing other American landscapes: Yosemite Valley, the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone's geysers, the redwood forests of California. He explained that the United States contained numerous national parks, areas set aside specifically to preserve natural wonders for future generations. The concept of dedicating vast territories solely for preservation, removing them from development or military use, seemed almost incomprehensible to men from a nation where every square mile served some strategic purpose. Harrison also shared production statistics, though he did so carefully, without triumphalism. He explained that American factories were producing one aircraft every 5 minutes, one ship every day. That the automobile plants of Detroit had been converted to produce tanks and trucks at a rate that matched the entire industrial output of Japan. He showed photographs of Liberty ships under construction, vast assembly lines creating vessels faster than they could be deployed. But he paired these displays of industrial might with something else: images of American life, children in schoolyards, families at baseball games, workers leaving factories at the end of their shifts, university students in cap and gowns. He wanted the prisoners to understand that this massive production came not from a starving, oppressed population driven by militaristic fervor, but from a nation of well-fed, educated citizens who believed in what they were fighting for. Sergeant Yamada listened to all of this with growing despair. He had commanded men in combat. He had told them they were fighting a weak, degenerate enemy that would collapse once faced with true Japanese martial spirit. He had believed it himself. Now he understood that he had sent men to die based on a complete fantasy. The Americans were not weak. They were not spiritually inferior. They simply had different values, different priorities, and those differences had made them far stronger than he had ever imagined. The return journey to Camp White was quiet. Some prisoners slept, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day. Others stared out the windows, watching the landscape pass, seeing it differently now. The forests no longer seemed threatening or wasteful. They represented a kind of wealth that could not be measured in military terms, a richness that came from preservation rather than exploitation. Captain Mitchell wrote in her report that evening that the experiment had exceeded her expectations. She noted that several prisoners had requested English language lessons upon their return, wanting to read American books and newspapers. Others had asked about the possibility of communicating with their families, wanting to tell them what they had seen. Most significantly, a number of prisoners had approached the camp chaplain, asking difficult questions about truth, duty, and what they owed to leaders who had deceived them. The impact of the Crater Lake trip rippled through Camp White in the weeks that followed. Prisoners who had been resistant to any interaction with Americans became more willing to talk, to ask questions, to engage. The level of cooperation increased noticeably. When camp authorities organized classes in woodworking, agriculture, and other practical skills, attendance surged. Men who had expected to die in combat or waste away in captivity began to think about futures that might include returning home. Not every prisoner was affected the same way. Some refused to believe that the lake was natural, insisting even years later that it must have been some kind of American trick. Others struggled with the cognitive dissonance, becoming withdrawn and depressed as they wrestled with contradictions they could not resolve. A few remained true believers in the cause for which they had fought, viewing the lake as simply an interesting geological feature with no larger meaning. But for many, perhaps most, the trip marked a turning point. Private Sato began keeping a detailed journal, recording his observations about American culture, technology, and values. He wrote that he wanted to understand how a nation so different from his own had managed to achieve so much. He filled page after page with questions, theories, reflections. After the conflict ended, he would return to Japan and eventually become a teacher himself, spending decades promoting cross-cultural understanding. Corporal Nakamura requested permission to write a letter to his father, knowing it might not be delivered for months or even years. In it, he described the lake in painstaking detail, trying to convey not just what it looked like, but what it meant. He wrote that he had learned something important, that there were different kinds of strength in the world, and that the kind he had been taught to value might not be the most important kind. His father received the letter in 1946, after the war had ended, and kept it for the rest of his life. Sergeant Yamada struggled more than most. He had been a career soldier, had built his entire identity around military service and loyalty to the Empire. The realization that his superiors had lied to him about fundamental facts felt like a personal betrayal. He became withdrawn, spending hours alone, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. But eventually, he too began to adapt. He started attending the English classes, not because he had any love for America, but because he wanted to understand how he had been so thoroughly deceived. The Crater Lake trip was repeated several times over the following year, with different groups of prisoners. Each time the reactions were similar: shock, disbelief, a gradual acceptance that forced a re-evaluation of long-held beliefs. Army psychological operations officers noted the results and attempted similar programs at other camps, with varying degrees of success. Nothing quite matched the impact of Crater Lake, perhaps because nothing else combined such unexpected natural beauty with such a powerful symbolic message. Major Harrison eventually wrote a paper on the program for the Army War College. In it, he argued that understanding an enemy required more than studying their military capabilities or strategic doctrine. It required understanding their worldview, their assumptions, the narratives they told themselves about who they were and who their enemies were. And sometimes, he suggested, the most effective way to change those narratives was not through argument or propaganda, but through direct experience that could not be argued away. Captain Mitchell went on to help design the psychological aspects of the occupation of Japan after the war ended. She drew heavily on her experiences at Camp White, particularly the Crater Lake trip. She advocated for programs that would expose Japanese citizens to American culture and values not through lectures or films, but through personal interactions and shared experiences. Many of her recommendations were implemented, contributing to the surprisingly successful post-war relationship between the two nations. The prisoners themselves, when they finally returned to Japan after the war's conclusion, carried with them memories that no amount of propaganda could erase. Some spoke openly about their experiences. though this often made them targets of criticism from those who had never surrendered. Others kept their thoughts private, but let their actions speak. They learned English, studied American methods, advocated for democracy and peaceful relations. They became bridges between two cultures that had tried to destroy each other. Decades later, in the 1980s, a group of former prisoners organized a reunion at Crater Lake. Fewer than 30 were still alive by then, elderly men accompanied by children and grandchildren. They stood at the same viewpoint where they had first seen the impossible blue water, and they told their families the story of that August day in 1943, when everything they thought they knew turned out to be wrong. Among them was Kenji Sato, now a retired professor of American literature. He had spent his career studying the works of Mark Twain, Ernest Hemingway, and John Steinbeck, trying to understand the culture that had produced both the terrible destruction of war and the unexpected mercy that had saved his life. He brought his granddaughter, a college student studying international relations. Together they walked down to the lake's edge, and he let the water run through his fingers, still marveling at its clarity. Sato told his granddaughter that this lake had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that assumptions are dangerous, that reality is always more complex than ideology suggests, and that there is more than one way to be strong. He said that he had come to the lake as a prisoner, convinced of his own righteousness and his enemy's degeneracy. He had left beginning to understand that the world was larger and stranger than he had imagined, and that wisdom required the humility to admit when you had been wrong. The water before them was exactly as blue as it had been 40 years earlier. The volcanic caldera had not changed, would not change for thousands more years. But the men who had once stood here as prisoners of war, certain of so much that turned out to be false, had been transformed by what they witnessed. They had learned that a nation wealthy enough to preserve such beauty, for no purpose other than beauty itself, possessed a kind of power that could not be matched on any battlefield. This lesson, hard-earned and impossible to convey to those who had not experienced it, became part of the complex legacy of the Pacific conflict. It did not erase the suffering, did not justify the violence, did not make the war any less tragic. But it suggested that even in the midst of terrible destruction, there could be moments of clarity, instances when enemies recognized their shared humanity and began the long process of becoming something other than enemies. The Crater Lake trips continued to be documented in military records, studied by historians of psychological operations, referenced in memoirs and academic papers. But perhaps the most significant impact was never recorded in any official document. It lived in the changed perspectives of men who had seen something beautiful enough to shatter their certainties, in the questions they asked afterward, in the ways they chose to live their lives once the fighting ended. Among those who returned for the reunion was Hiroshi Tanaka, the former schoolteacher, who had written so extensively about the experience in his diary. He had indeed returned to teaching after the war, but he had changed his curriculum dramatically. Instead of teaching the narrow nationalism that had dominated Japanese education before and during the conflict, he focused on comparative cultures, encouraging his students to question assumptions and seek direct knowledge, rather than accepting official narratives. He brought his daughter to Crater Lake, a woman who had become a diplomat, working to strengthen ties between Japan and the United States. She had grown up hearing her father's stories about the blue water that changed his understanding of the world. Standing at the rim, Tanaka told her something he had never quite put into words before. He explained that the lake had taught him about honesty. Not the simple honesty of telling the truth versus telling lies, but the deeper honesty of being willing to admit when you are wrong, when your entire framework for understanding the world has been built on false premises. He said that his generation had failed in this kind of honesty, had clung to comfortable lies rather than facing uncomfortable truths, and that this failure had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. His daughter listened quietly, then asked if he thought the current generation had learned this lesson. Tanaka considered the question carefully. He said that every generation must learn it anew, that the human tendency to believe comforting falsehoods never disappears. But he hoped that by sharing stories like this one, by preserving the memory of what had happened at this lake, they might make the lesson a little easier to learn, the truth a little harder to ignore. The reunion concluded with a simple ceremony. The former prisoners placed a plaque near the viewpoint, written in both Japanese and English. It read, "In memory of our journey from ignorance to understanding, may those who visit this place find the courage to question what they have been taught, and the wisdom to accept what they discover." The plaque remained there for decades, weathering the harsh mountain winters, a small monument to an unusual chapter in the history of conflict and reconciliation. Park rangers at Crater Lake noticed over the years that Japanese visitors would sometimes stand at that viewpoint for extraordinarily long periods, often visibly emotional. When asked, some would explain that they had relatives who had been prisoners during the war, who had visited this place and been profoundly affected by it. Others simply said that they had heard the story and wanted to see for themselves what could inspire such transformation. The lake itself remained unchanged, indifferent to the human dramas played out along its shores. The water continued to display that impossible blue, fed by snowmelt and rain, isolated from the contamination that affected so many other bodies of water. Scientists who studied the lake marveled at its purity, its clarity, its resistance to the pollution that marked human presence almost everywhere else. In a sense, the lake represented what the former prisoners had come to understand about truth itself, pure, clear, undeniable, and ultimately more powerful than any amount of propaganda or self-deception. The blue water of Crater Lake, formed by ancient volcanic forces, preserved by American conservation efforts, revealed to Japanese prisoners of war in the middle of history's most destructive conflict, became an accidental instrument of transformation. It demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapon against ignorance and hatred is simple truth, presented in a form too overwhelming to deny. And it showed that nature itself, indifferent to human conflicts, could accomplish what all the speeches and propaganda of wartime could not: force men to see beyond the lies they had been told and recognize the possibility of a different future. The story of those August days in 1943, when 500 prisoners climbed into army trucks expecting one thing and discovered something entirely different, became part of the unofficial history of the war. It was not taught in military academies, did not appear in most textbooks, was rarely mentioned in official accounts, but it was passed down through families, shared in private conversations, remembered by those who understood that the most important victories are sometimes the ones that happen in individual hearts rather than on battlefields. For the men who stood at that rim and saw water too blue to believe, for the officers who organized the trip, hoping to change minds, for the families who later learned the story and tried to understand what it meant, Crater Lake represented something more than just a geological wonder. It became a symbol of the possibility of transformation, evidence that even the most deeply held beliefs can be overturned by direct encounter with undeniable reality. And in that sense, the lake's lesson extended far beyond the specific circumstances of that particular conflict, speaking to the universal human capacity to grow beyond our conditioning, to question our assumptions, and to build understanding across even the deepest divides. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.